So why would they call themselves House of David if David never existed? I'm just going to call myself an American, but America never existed. Silly. We got this question, this comment, this response on a Tel Dan inscription video we made a while back. And we want to clarify some things about our position and a misunderstanding we think is happening here in this comment. The first one is this. The Tel Dan inscription is support to the idea that there was an understanding of some David having existed. This is the question of the historical David. Was there an individual named David that had some power that set up a political body, a ruling territory in this region? The Tel Dan inscription is a piece of support to the idea that, yeah, there was someone named David that set up a house of David here that was understood to have power. However, that does not mean that the David we see in the Bible has to have existed as the Bible described. That's the distinction. David can have existed as a historical figure as supported by the Tel Dan inscription without everything the Bible says about David being true. David doesn't have to have fought Goliath like the Bible says. David doesn't have to have fled from Saul like the Bible says, just because the Tel Dan inscription mentions David. Those two things are not dependent on each other. And we can see this if we take the second part of the, well, I'm going to call myself an American, but America never existed, silly. Let's look at some figures in America's history. George Washington. George Washington is a historical figure. We know that he existed. However, that doesn't mean that every story that gets told about George Washington is true. What about George Washington and the cherry tree? Do we stake historical fact and reality and truth onto that because, well, George Washington existed, so therefore this story has to be true? No, we don't do that. We look at that story and say, okay, this is an idea of who this person is and why they mattered for us in the past, and all types of things get layered onto that. But just because an individual existed does not mean every story about them is true. So the Tel Dan inscription, yes, tells us that they understood someone named David to have existed. That does not mean, however, that everything we read about David in the Bible happened.